I'm absolutely privileged today to be joined in conversation by humanitarian Sir Terry Waite. Sir Terry couldn't be in the studio, so I'm delighted that we're at least able to have this conversation virtually. Sir Terry became a well-known public figure when he was taken hostage in 1987 and spent 5 years in I think, solitary confinement for 4 of the 5 years. And you were the longest held hostage in the history of the United Kingdom. Building on, I guess, that horrendous experience, you've become actively engaged in humanitarian and charitable endeavours ever since, and before, of course. So welcome, Sir Terry. Can you reflect a little on, what life was like before you were taken hostage, and how it changed? I guess you don't know what you would have been like had you not been taken hostage and kept in confinement for 5 years. But I guess you must have reflected on that. Life changed in that moment forever.
Well, I've always had a life that has involved me in fairly difficult situations. I mean, I began life fairly gently after Frances and I were married, working as an education officer in the Diocese of Bristol. I'd often been asked, if I wanted to be ordained, and I didn't. I'm a layman. Many people still confuse me with being a clergyman. I've even had letters addressed to Archbishop Terry Waite, which is elevated me far beyond my station. So I've remained a layman by choice. But I've most of my life, I've worked from a church base. And as I say, I began in Bristol, and then with my young family and my wife, we moved to Africa, to Uganda, where I was the advisor to the first African Archbishop, and extensively travelled across Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and southern Sudan. And it was at the time there of the Amin coup, when Gerald Amin came to power, the last king of Scotland, as he designated himself. And it was a brutal time. Many of my colleagues were thrown into jail because they were the wrong tribe or the wrong political party. And many were murdered. I mean, I've never seen so many horrific events as I've witnessed in Uganda in those years. Between Kampala and Jinja, which is a small town 60 miles away from Kampala, runs the River Nile, and the Oim Falls Dam. And that dam became blocked with the bodies of people who'd been thrown into it, which gives you an idea of the extent of the misery and horror that people faced. And my wife and I, we were held up twice at gunpoint. We almost lost our lives twice. But mostly we escaped that. And I became involved there with negotiating with the men whom I knew for the release of some of my colleagues. And I was successful in a few cases, but I'm afraid a lot I was not successful. So from there, we moved to Rome. I was seconded to work with the Roman Catholic Church, based in Rome, but traveling the world, helping them develop programs of changing the health structure. They had large hospitals, and the need was there more for preventative medicine, so helping the development of preventative schemes. And again, that was in every troubled spot of the world. And I was constantly on the move for 7 years. I worked in that role. Then I was involved with hostage taking once again when I came to Lambeth Palace as an advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And because families came to Lambeth to ask for help when their relatives or whoever it was disappeared, I did my best to help them. I've always had the belief that if anybody turns to the church, regardless of whether they have religious belief or not, if there's anything that could be done to help them, then one should do it. And that's how I became involved in hostage taking. First of all, I think with Iran at the time of the Iranian Revolution, when I negotiated with the Revolutionary Guards, then with Gaddafi, number of other smaller events, and then, of course, Beirut, where I was captured. That brings us up to the capture. But that wasn't my sole work. I mean, I've often been described as the Archbishop's envoy, but my job really was to really be a member of his private staff, to travel with him, and to arrange his meetings with heads of state, heads of churches, ordinary people around the world. And it was a constant, very, very busy job indeed. And at the time when I was involved with negotiating in Beirut, I was visiting China preparing for a visit there, visiting Australia. So I was on and off the planes all the time. I'm relieved these days not to be doing that, particularly as airports have developed as they've developed. So that brings us roughly up to Beirut.
Yes. Do you think that with if I can put it this way, as a faith not envoy, but representative of a church leader, that you were in some way protected in negotiating with for hostages in countries where maybe the Christian faith wasn't recognized? I mean, that level of resilience is quite remarkable, that you had the courage to go in where you were effectively not protected by your status.
Well, I think one thing you have to say, first of all, that when you do the job of hostage negotiating, you've got to face the fact, before you ever step onto a plane, that you might be killed or captured. Because my style of hostage taking has always been to seek a direct face-to-face encounter with those who have a prime responsibility for the hostages. And that's a dangerous thing, because you'll come across all types of people, and sometimes psychopathic individuals who are unpredictable in their behavior. And as I said, if you can't face that fact, then you shouldn't do the job at all. I mean, many people have said in the past, or a number of people have said, oh, that fellow, utterly reckless because he thought he had the protection of God or somebody. Well, I never believed that for one moment. I believe if you have faith, it doesn't give you any certain protections of the kind that some people imagine. I think it gives you resources to deal with situations, but don't expect suddenly to be plucked out of danger by angels descending from heaven. I don't think that will happen. So I ended with that knowledge, and the fact that I did represent a religious leader was in fact a great asset, because they did have, belonging to different faiths, they did have a respect in the main for a religious leader, and they had respect for Robert Rumsey, who was, a very, in my opinion, a very good and able Archbishop.
So, what did you sort of wake up one day and decide, I'm going to be a hostage negotiator? What brought you to that place? Because it's a very unusual. I mean, it's not a profession, is it? But in a sense, for you, you have done it multiple times, and I think people will be interested to hear, how you got to deciding that you wanted to do this incredibly dangerous work.
Well, as I said earlier, I was drawn into it in Uganda simply because of need. There was nobody else doing it, and going back now quite a number of years, I mean, there was no formal training for hostage negotiators. I mean, nowadays, of course, people are trained especially for it. And I myself have done training for the police and public services in negotiation for hostages, which usually are, different type of hostage situation, usually domestic violence and what have you, that sort of thing. But there are two types of hostage take. Well, there are three really, but two main types. One is what you might call political hostage taking, where hostages are taken, and the group taking them want to achieve a political end and use the hostages as pressure points for that. The other one would be criminal hostage taking, where the demands are made purely for money. Now, both of those, of course, are criminal activities, but the way you negotiate in those situations is different. If you're negotiating politically for a political end, then that's one way. If it's money, it's another way. All my experience really has been in the political side. I haven't had, I've never dealt with situations where money has been the prime reason for abduction. And then there's a third area now, which is becoming increasingly common and very difficult to deal with, and that is arbitrary detention, where an individual will be taken by and thrown into prison, usually by a government who are making demands of one kind or another. But often the charges against that individual are spurious charges. I mean, I'm at the moment dealing with certainly a case of that kind, and there are many cases of it. Arbitrary detention has increased considerably in the last few years, and it's extremely difficult for governments to deal with that, to be seen to be interfering in what is considered to be the legal process of another country, which may indeed, in some instances, be a corrupt process, and definitely corruption enters into it in a number of these instances of arbitrary detention. Very difficult. So again, I've not had a lot of experience in arbitrary detention, but some in recent years. But my primary experience has been in the political area.
I hope you don't mind me mentioning, Sir Terry, but you are 85, and clearly you're still both very active and very engaged in the whole issue of hostage taking. My podcast is very much looking at the input of older generations and the attitude towards age and aging in the UK. How have you felt? Is aging helpful in understanding the processes that you've been through during your life?
I think if you're able, I don't mind being old at all. I mean, you recognise it comes on you rather quickly, really. I think yes. Suddenly you realise, good heavens, it's only 5 years now. I've been 90. And you have memories of childhood when you saw people of 65 who were staggering around, and you say, well, that's 20 years ago as far as I'm concerned. So it suddenly comes upon you. I mean, I think there are it's got its real benefits, because you have, if you've been a reflective person, you have a whole range of experiences to draw on, and if you've got any realistic understanding of yourself, you've made lots of mistakes, and you can probably try and say, well, I'm not going to make those again. I'm going to keep well away from those. But the mistakes have been beneficial because you've learned from them, if you've got any reflection at all. I think it's important to reflect. I mean, I had plenty of opportunity in solitary confinement to reflect on my life and, to make certain discoveries. I mean, I can tell you quite openly, one of the discoveries I made was what a great capacity I had for deceiving myself, for thinking I was doing something for one reason and doing it for another. So all captivity and solitary confinement wasn't all negative. It was an opportunity for self-reflection, for one might say a deep personal analysis of oneself, and try and really come to terms, which really was a very useful process, an extraordinarily difficult process, but a useful one. So yes, on the one hand, you've got years to look back on and reflect on, and you have a little more time. I mean, at one time when I set up Hostage International or other organizations, I was frantically busy attending committees, dealing with all the, as chairman of committees. I'm freed of that responsibility now, and I'm just president of organizations, which is means that I have a lot more freedom to think and to act, and to also work with people individually in a way that I didn't have. So it can be a liberating experience. The great thing about getting older is, if possible, try and keep your mind alive. Someone once said to me about a clergyman, you can always tell where a clergyman is. Just have a look at his study and see what books he's got. And if there are no books there from the last 20 years, you know he's pretty well packed up. Well, maybe that's changed a bit now. The internet, and we can all have mechanical stuff that way. But there's a certain truth in that, to keep your mind alive, to keep fresh, and to listen to as many different points of view as you can. And then, you have a lifetime of experience to evaluate as best you can. All those circumstances have changed. So I think it can be a very good period. I mean, the negative side, of course, you're going to have illnesses. The doctor's going to be ringing you up and say, "I'm concerned about your blood sugar or whatever. You better come in." And you're going to, oh dear, the end is drawing nigh. But then, take it as it comes. The great thing is this: that we should take care of our body, which is important, but it's equally important to take care of the inner person, the real you. Some would say that's the spiritual side of life, and I use that not in religious terms, but in terms of the real person. We can see that what that means when whenever you've been to seen a dead body, somebody who's just died. You know something has left that person, and that's just a body now. And so take care of the inner person, and you've got time to do that when you're older. You've got time to do it because certain things that you used to do. I mean, I used to do a lot of walking. I can't walk far now. I'm dependent on other things. So, but you can still develop your inner mind. And that's, again, another lesson I learned from captivity. The way to survive without books, without papers, when you're chained to the wall, when you're sleeping on the floor, you keep your mind alive. I wrote in my head. I wrote books in my head, and that's a way to survive, way to keep going.
Do you think people are afraid of solitude?
Well, I think so. I think a lot of people are afraid of it. And I have to say, I too didn't particularly care for it years ago. I knew there was a part of me that desired it, but I didn't particularly care for it. I was always rushing to fill the space, with other people or with other places. And I think it's something you have to grow into. You can't suddenly expect to enjoy solitude all the time. You've got to get into the process of it and begin to enjoy it. And I do enjoy it now. I mean, I've written a book on solitude when I went around, met different people in different solitary situations, in Australia, in the bush, and so on and so forth, who'd really found life extremely fulfilling. Now, I don't think I'm not talking about being a hermit and isolating yourself completely from people, but I think a good balance to have time alone, which you can enjoy, and that can be refreshed also by time with other people. And I've always found too that people who've had that, I mean, certain religious people, certain religious sisters who've spent time in solitude, they can be, when they meet people, the most delightful company, the most engaging company, because they can give themselves fully in the moment to the person they're talking to. And that often is a product of being able to use solitude constructively.
So do you think that, if you go on the tube, you'll see everybody on their phones, and everybody feels the need to constantly be doing something and engage, whether it's in social media or chatting to friends. That absence of quiet in our lives, I guess, is something that we can't turn the clock back on technology. But there is this debate at the moment around whether children should have mobile phones in schools because it directly affects their ability to learn. I mean, do you think that as a society, we need to reflect more on the absence of quiet as something that has a really serious impact on the way we live our lives.
Well, as you correctly say, we can't reverse technology. It's going to press forward, whether we like it or not. And we're on the edge now of big developments in AI, and that's going to have, again, fundamental changes. And I think it's inevitable, but some degree of control, either by state control or by individual control of use of it, is absolutely essential. Because what is happening is that I think it's increasing in individuals, increasing anxiety. For example, I find this now, that I have to be doubly careful about being scammed. And it's a worry. It is a constant worry. Is this authentic? Is this genuine? And then, when you get a phone call, or when you get email messages, or when you send off, and the fact that so much is being done via the electronic media, which sometimes you cannot check and you cannot speak to people. I mean, so many people complain, do they not, when they phone up about a product or something or other, they're talking to an electronic voice and not to a person. And it heightens anxiety in people, particularly in older people. I mean, there's a natural tendency, I think, when you get older, to be a little more cautious because you've had life experience and you know what can happen. When you're young and you think, well, you can drive at X miles an hour and just get away with it and do this, that, and the other. You take all sorts of chances, which you would never dream of taking when you're older, because you've had the experience, what can go wrong. And that things can go wrong when you get older. Anxiety increases, and people are increasingly worried about that. And in many cases, it's leading to severe mental illness. There's a man called Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist. And Ian McGilchrist has written very extensively about the brain and about the development of technology and how the left hemisphere of the brain, which is the area of calculation, measurement, etc., is being fed by technology because of computerization and so on, to the neglect very often of the right hemisphere, which is the area of the arts, the area of poetry, imagination. And somehow he says this is leading us to be off balance as a society, to be more fractious, to be more fractious with individuals in relationships. And we see that. We see this growing anger. I mean, I don't think I'm mistaken when I say, you can see it in simple things like road rage. People are extremely quick to act aggressively, whereas we need to have this sort of inner balance between the two hemispheres of the brain. And in our public policy, I think we're making a mistake by, I think it's understandable why it's being done, but I think it is a mistake to push arts to the boundary, because the arts, which are predominantly the area of imagination and creativity in the right hemisphere of the brain, are important for balanced individuals. That's where, the old concept of a university for holistic education was a pretty good concept. But will modern society, this is a big question, will modern society allow us to have that holistic concept now? Or has technology got such a grip on us that inevitably we chase it, rather like the Gadarene swine, and fall over the cliff? I mean, who knows? I think it's a real difficulty. It's a real problem for those who are directing public policy to how to control this, if it can be controlled.
Absolutely. You've traveled so extensively around the world. Are there other cultures, other countries that you think have got a better understanding of
no,
the balance of life?
No, I don't know. I don't think so at all. I think we're all in the same global mess. I mean, you look around and you look at the structures, the political structures of other countries, and they're all struggling at the moment. I think we're all struggling. It's a global problem. And this is where I feel, we just cannot tackle some of these problems on an individual basis, on a national basis. Like for example, the big problem of immigration. It's not just a question for one country. We're going to see in the coming years the increasing migration of people as climate changes, as it becomes extraordinarily difficult for people to live in certain parts of the world. Migration of people is going to increase. And you can't tackle it just on an individual basis. There has to be cooperation between the nations. And that's true in so many things. And we just seem pretty well incapable of having really effective cooperation. We set up mechanisms to deal with that, like the UN and what have you. But they function at half cock very often. Not necessarily because of their own fault, sometimes because of their own fault, but just we've got a lot to learn about how to deal collectively with the changing world as it is changing. And we need to keep up to date with that.
Yes, I mean, I know that we all need to learn from history so it doesn't repeat itself. I mean, interestingly, the year of your birth was the outbreak of World War II. We find ourselves now in a world that feels more unsafe than ever, since the peace after World War II. It's interesting. I was in Beirut actually in 1975, and again a couple of years ago with the Mines Advisory Group, looking at the terrible remains of the ongoing unrest in Lebanon over a period of decades, and over 1 million landmines that mean that what was a incredibly fertile and productive country is still on its knees. I know you went back to Beirut, didn't you, because you didn't want to hold hatred in your heart, and that forgiveness was really important for you. But do you despair sometimes that we don't seem to have made much progress in finding lasting peace in the Middle East?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I went back to Beirut. I went to meet my captors, who had developed. I mean, they changed from, well, at that point, they predominantly were not engaged in what might be termed terrorist activities, but were, becoming a fully fledged political party. And they did actually apologize to me for what had happened. And we were beginning to start a useful and creative dialogue there, which was hopefully built into a larger peace process. But then suddenly, things turned around again in Lebanon, and they had these terrible troubles, economic difficulties, and what have you, and things have fallen by the wayside for the moment. But I think, I've worked quite a lot in Israel and in the occupied territories, and I've worked on both sides of the territories with families in Israel who've been victims of murder, and families in the occupied territories who've had the same and the harassment and what have you. So I've seen it from both sides, and I just despair of that situation. It's so complicated. On the one hand, Israel takes the line that it does, a hard line, because because of its system of government, and you have to keep all people from extreme positions on both sides. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, the Palestinians really have great difficulty in agreeing amongst themselves. They can be very factious. But somehow we have to pursue dialogue there. We have to be patient and pursue dialogue, not just aggressive behavior. We're far too quick in the world at the moment to resort to aggression. One of the ways in which, I was always told when I was in the negotiating process, you'll never be able to talk with revolutionary guards. They're impossible. You'll never talk with them. Well, it's not true. One could talk with them. One could try and treat them, first of all, putting out of your mind some of the terrible things that they are alleged to have done, and trying to treat the people you're talking with as people, as individuals, trying to understand why they behave as they behave. You don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, but try and understand why they're doing it and get to the root of the issue. And that, whilst should do that on an individual basis in negotiations, I think we should try and find devised ways of doing that on an international basis to try and get to the root of why countries are behaving, and have much more dialogue rather than being quick to go to warfare. But of course, I think often, again, we're deceiving ourselves about warfare, because warfare brings with it some very considerable economic benefits for some of the countries who are supplying the weapons of war. And I mean, although I'm by no means am I a Marxist, by no means am I a communist, by no means, but I do think Karl Marx said something pretty accurate when he said the primary determinant in most situations is the economic determinant. That many of our activities are governed by our own economic interests. And he was pretty well right there, I think. And we need to be truthful and honest about motive, and whether we really want peace, or whether we really want to have a peaceful and stable world. Terribly difficult problems. I mean, it's easy to sit here and pontificate. I know how difficult they are. But I think we need to have concentrated attention on these matters of how to engage in dialogue rather than engage in warfare all the time.
Indeed, yes. I think the challenge is that the world has become, in some ways, much smaller in that everybody has access to global information, at the touch of an iPhone, and yet an understanding of the complex history of the different regions and the emotional relationship of peoples. I mean, I think you mentioned that the Palestinians and Israelis. That I was both in Lebanon and in Israel, and I think it's very difficult to judge. There isn't a sort of single blame to be laid anywhere. But the atrocities that we saw in October the 7th clearly shocked the world. And the fact that these things still happen, they're happening in Africa and they don't get as much attention because, for whatever reason, the media don't cover it as much. Do you sometimes lose hope that, the world can be a safer and more compassionate place?
I don't lose hope. No, I still maintain hope, but I recognize increasing complexity and difficulty of the situation. I mean, I think going back to a personal philosophy, just moving back from the global scene to a personal philosophy, I think there are three key points which I think we could do well to contemplate. And that is to work for. And that is, going back to what I said a moment ago, unity within, harmony within ourselves. You can't be a peacemaker, really, unless to a certain degree you have a degree of inner harmony yourself. That's important, and that's a lifelong process. You don't suddenly find that you're a harmonious individual. Well, I don't think you ever find it completely in life anyway. I think you're always a bit at odds somewhere. But that's one thing. Then I think the second thing is harmony with your neighbor. To be in, as far as possible, doesn't mean to accept everything, but to be in good relations. And thirdly, which is increasingly important, harmony with the environment. We've misused and we continue to misuse the environment, and they're paying an awful price for it, and will pay an increasing price for it in the coming years. And those three things, from a personal philosophy, I think are pretty important. And if more and more people could do that, and if I mean, I often think, going back to my relationship with the church, the church is somehow not really getting to the real spiritual needs of people, tinkering around with language, tinkering around with this, that, and the other. I discover when I go around and when I speak to different groups, as I do quite a lot still, that people still have one might term a spiritual hunger. I mean, I wouldn't use it. You can't use those terms, but they know that there's something in their life that is beyond the material, and if you can touch that and speak to that and address that, people respond as they do. I find that all time and time again, and not in narrow religious ways. I don't like to call myself religious. I think it's got so many negative connotations these days. But there's a big difference between being, inverted commas, religious and having a spiritual outlook, having a deeper outlook in life, and recognizing that not everything is actually described in material terms.
So, Terry, there are a couple of questions that I like to ask all my guests, and the one which I think we'll go back to your much younger self. So prior to your experience in sort of hostage negotiation, maybe the young man who lived in that quiet village, was it in Cheshire? Who's the village Bobby and everything. Exactly. What advice, with all the wisdom that you've accumulated over the last 85 years, you would give that younger man?
I'd say don't despair. I mean, I remember very well when I was young, a story from young. We had very little money. I mean, policemen were paid very little in those days. We had to depend on our large garden, to produce vegetables and occasional chicken from a local farmer. And the only time I ever saw chicken when I was young was at Christmas, when the farmer gave us a chicken and we had a Christmas dinner. Who would believe that these days? But anyway, looking back on those years, I remember the school I attended. They were going to take people on a trip to France, and I wanted to travel. I was so anxious to travel, and we couldn't raise the £15 required in those days to go. And I remember sitting in the classroom and seeing the coach draw up outside, and the kids who were getting on the coach. I thought to myself, oh, there goes my chance. I shall never see the world now. So what I'm saying is, don't despair. I mean, you when you're young, you think, oh goodness, everything's collapsed, everything's failed. But life is full of opportunities. So I would say, don't despair. Whether you're younger, things can change. And also, one important thing: disaster and suffering is going to strike everybody to a greater or lesser degree, and in some more than others, of course, through no fault of their own. And there's no reasonable explanation for that. That is life. That's what happens. But when suffering does occur, in the vast majority of cases, within that suffering, there are seeds of something new and something creative, if you can find it and look for it. I mean, I would never, ever, without captivity, I would never have had the courage to leave a salaried job and to say, I'm going to earn my own living by writing and lecturing, and I'm going to give my time away to the various organizations that I've supported over the years and not take money from. I'd never have had the courage to do that without having had nothing for 5 years. So out of sort of something which was pretty grim and pretty miserable, a lot of very good and creative things have happened, totally to my surprise. So I say, don't despair, keep hope alive.
Excellent. And finally, do you have a bucket list? I mean, do you still have things that you haven't yet achieved that you want to?
I don't have great ambitions now, really. No, I really don't. I mean, I've been to pretty well everywhere I want to go in the world. Many places I don't want to go again to. So, but I don't think I do. I'd like to be able to live life as fully as I can now, and continue with what I'm doing, and not be a nuisance to other people. And I hope that I can, eventually, when I do die, that I shall be able to say, well, I did my best, and I wasn't too much of a nuisance to everybody else.
Terry, it's been an absolute honour. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks. Bye.